Let me close by saying I hope you will take full advantage of these 3 days. The most important thing is not what happens in the session rooms, it's also in the networking opportunities and the relationships that you build, that you carry forward from today, and not have a situation in which you reconnect a year from now when you're back at Growth Week. We want your feedback. You'll have feedback opportunities to help shape Growth Week next year even better than we were able to do this year. So thank you all very much for being here, and I'll turn over now to my colleague Alden Winters, who's the Chief Economist for DFID, based in London. And DFID is our major funder, and in fact, the work that the IGC network does, which we see as a 10-year program, is funded periodically by DFID. DFID's role and understanding of our role is very clear.
The mission to remove poverty, to reduce poverty in the world, and it is for that reason that we were so keen to establish a really top-rate group that could help that process. We're interested in long-run growth, we're interested in how countries cope with downturns and with shocks. And we see 3 roles which have to be played, and 3 roles which the IGC is able to play in achieving this. The first of these is to provide developing country policymakers with demand-led, independent and cutting-edge policy advice based on the latest research. Not just pot-boiler textbook advice, but really smart people engaging with really important problems there and then. Now, necessarily, lots of the most useful advice is rather private, but among the sorts of things which the IGC has already delivered is advice in Ghana and Uganda about oil revenues. It's contributed to macroeconomic frameworks in the Ghanaian budget. It's estimated money demand models in Tanzania, and I understand being asked if it will help with similar work elsewhere. And there's been a very important exercise mapping industry in Ethiopia. That's just 4 of the examples. This, it seems to us, of bringing really high-quality minds to bear on pressing problems, is the defining characteristic of the IGC. And we're delighted at the extent to which that's happened in the countries we're established, and we're looking forward to extending the reach into the new countries that we are starting to work on now. The second element of the IGC is world-class research, addressing questions that are critical to growth and questions that are pressing and said to be pressing by developing countries. You'll hear lots of that research here and now, and over the next year, quite a number of the projects which the IGC started in its first year will be bearing fruit, and at least some of us are looking forward to these research results very much indeed. The third element is to build an international growth network, to be the international lesson learning centre for the world, to bring a wide range of people to focus on growth, the go-to place for economic growth. That's, I guess, the role that Growth Week plays now, and looking at the hall that's completely packed, it's really very gratifying to us to see how well that is going. We do believe that the IGC can become the institution in the world for developing countries to come to when they have growth issues. And we see the network as involving people at very, very many different activities and at different levels, a very broad range of players, including policymakers and academics, civil society, private sector, and both in industrial countries, but in particularly in developing countries. It's a huge delight to see so many people here this afternoon, and as I said, I want to thank you all very much for coming, although I'm sure that you all could tell from the programme that you really had to be here. It really is the most splendid 3 days that I can imagine. I don't know if it's for me to carry on and welcome Paul Collier, but I hope you will all with me. And welcome Paul Collier, who's here to talk about China's strategy for gaining access to Africa's natural resources and what this means for Africa's development.
Thank you very much. China in Africa is really big news. It's the biggest news that's hit Africa, I think, in my working lifetime. It's not just a big new player, it's the big player. And it's a very, very different player from anything we've seen before. So this is the first point, this is really big. I'm going to make 4 points as to the different modes of engagement that China has with Africa. And the first one is obviously going to be resource extraction. Now, resource extraction of natural resources is Africa's big chance for transformative development. It's a big chance because the scale of the money involved is going to dwarf everything else over the next decade or so. It will dwarf aid, it will dwarf capital inflows, it will dwarf remittances. This is the big money. My favourite figure, which you'll find in my little book, The Plunder Planet, as it happens, is that if we take the average square mile of the rich countries and compare them with the average square mile of Africa, there's very different subsoil assets value underneath that square mile. Last time I spoke in the LSE, I teased the audience into guessing. I gave you the figure for the OECD, which was about $300,000 per square mile. And I teased the audience with what was the figure for Africa. Was it less or was it more? I'll not waste time doing it again. But let me astonish the people who didn't hear that by saying that the figure for Africa is not even more, it's radically less. It's about $60,000. It's about a fifth of the OECD figure. That's not because there's less down there. Why should there? These are two huge chunks of the Earth's surface, and we're looking at fundamental geological processes. It's because less has been discovered. And that massive failure of the discovery process is itself a huge economic phenomenon. By hook or by crook, and probably by crook, it will be fixed over the next decade. And so the scale of resources coming out of Africa will be massive. Multiply by 5 the sort of volumes we've got at the moment to get the order of magnitude that's likely. So this is already the big money for Africa. Something like 2/3 of Africa's assets are natural assets. That's the known assets. Multiply by 5 to get to the as yet to be discovered, but likely to be discovered over the next decade. So that upstream potential from the discovery and extraction of natural resources is hugely important for Africa. Dwarfs everything else. There's a concomitant downstream agenda. Because, of course, Africa's been there before in valuable resource extraction. This was the commodity booms of the second half of the 1970s, early 80s. And with a few honourable exceptions, Africa's precious little to show for that very substantial pulse of resources taken out of the continent. The fundamental economics of this are not very complicated. Doing it gets complicated, but the fundamental economics, you're taking natural assets out from under the ground, and you've got to end up with invested assets on top of the ground. Now, doing that is really complicated, but China is again unique in being at both ends. It's a massive player in the upstream, the extraction process, and it's equally a massive player, new player in the downstream of putting those assets in place. So it's big in both, and it's unique in operating in both. And now let's have a look at what that resource extraction involves with China. And the first is it brings a very good thing, which in one word is competition. There was a cosy club of resource extraction, and China's entry has busted that cosy club, and that's very helpful. That competition has, of course, driven up prices spectacularly, but it's more than just price competition. As we discovered during the global crisis, the global market in commodities is not quite as classic spot clearing market that we'd imagined. Right? It's a little bit more like manufacturing markets than we'd thought. Long-term contracts, quantity matters as well as price. Right? So that's the first thing, competition. A new player has had very important and positive effects. Let's have a look at the structure of the contracts. Now, the structure of the contracts breaches Fiscal Economics 101 textbook principles. Because Fiscal Economics 101 textbook principles says you gather all the government revenues into the budget, and then when you've got the gathered pot, you think about how to spend it. Right? And that preserves all the marginal efficiencies. A dollar spent on this is the same as a dollar spent on that at the margin. So, right? That's textbook Fiscal 101. And China's contracts, the structure of the contracts breaches that because the same deal that generates the revenues decides how to spend them. Right? It's resource extraction in return for infrastructure. Now, that breaches Principle 101 fiscal. Bad. Are there any redeeming features? Right? Well, I'm going to suggest that there are two redeeming features, but to get to them, you have to go beyond textbook 101 fiscal. Right? So let's turn a few more pages. In fact, let's pick up a more complicated book. And the first big advantage of these deals, of the structure of these deals, comes in the resolution of the time inconsistency problem. Imagine yourself to be a finance minister of an African country. Now, for some people here, that won't be very difficult to imagine. Harder for me than for them. Right? So, and you've read textbook Fiscal 101, and if you haven't read it, it's been read out to you repeatedly by the IMF teams every time they come into the country. Right? And you think, that sounds a really good idea, this Fiscal 101. I get the money in, and then that's depleting the natural asset base. And I know that any responsible and ethical government is going to offset that depletion of the natural asset base by investing in other assets. Right? I know that. And then I think, so according to Fiscal 101, I just go and tell that to the cabinet. And they'll do it. They'll agree with me. And then you start to think, oh my God. Right? There are 30 people there, all representing spending ministries, and there's me. Right? And I'll say, the good news is we've got, $2 billion of natural resource extraction coming in, and we need to spend that on investment. And the bad news is that the Minister of Defence will look meaningfully at the President and say, I think we ought to raise military salaries. Right? Or if we're going to invest, let's invest in housing for the military, right? To take a hypothetical example. Sorry, that's an inside joke. In other words, the finance minister might think, I just can't deliver textbook 101. If the revenue comes in to the budget, I won't be able to control the political battle of how it goes out. And the chances of this actually being spent on investment, on any sort of useful investment, are very low. And the neat thing about the Chinese deal is that the one signature locks me in. It's a commitment technology. It locks me in to using these resources for investment, for infrastructure investment. And that might be a very sound thing to do. So that's one big advantage. there's a more subtle advantage. And this comes out of some of the work of people like Tim Besley. Tim's latest work argues, pretty convincingly, I think, that the sine qua non of building an effective and capable state is that the state needs to build tax capacity. It needs to have a strong tax revenue base, because only if it's got a strong tax revenue base has it got an interest in the growth of the economy. Because with a strong tax revenue base, it takes a share of the growth of the economy. So that's a political economy point. Now, if that's right, then resource extraction is potentially very bad news, because this is big revenue flowing into the government budget without any taxation of the rest of the economy. And resource extraction can get very big relative to the rest of the economy in a lot of these small economies. So it's quite possible that the political economy is such that you don't actually need any other revenues. So you never build this tax system which gives you the state a share of future economic growth. And so you've no interest in building future economic growth. The Besley theory is you build a tax system and that gives you an incentive to provide the public goods such as property rights, contract enforcement, which then grow the economy. Okay. And now we turn back to this Chinese model, and it's actually quite attractive again. Just think, if I was the finance minister and I'd read Besley, then I'd say, this is another big win, because the revenue never comes in. If I'm a government, I still need revenue. I can still build a tax system. Yes, the resource extraction translates into investment, but it's a direct thing. It's a bypass of state revenue. And so, yes, I need revenue for all sorts of things. I've got to build that revenue base. So, the structure of the contracts, this unique resource extraction in return for infrastructure, although it reaches Fiscal 101, I think has these two very positive features. It resolves that, it gives the commitment technology to the government, and it avoids the problem of killing off the need for taxation. That's the structure of the contracts. Now let me turn to the process of the contracts. Now the process of the contracts you can look at in two different lights. The President of China went around Africa 2 or 3 years ago saying, we won't ask any questions. Right? And the kind interpretation of that is to say, well, that's very trusting. That we're getting away from any sniff or smell or taint of conditionality. This is African resources, and what the Africans do with the money is up to Africans. It's nothing to do with outsiders. We will dig out your copper if you sell us the rights, and what you do with the money, that's up to you. If you want infrastructure, that's up to you. You sign, we'll sign, and there you go. We won't ask any questions about that. We'll just build an infrastructure, and that's that. So that's the favourable gloss, that it's trusting, it's non-conditional. The bad side interpretation is this is a bit of opportunism. That it's going into situations where opaque deals, corruption can thrive, and at its worst, it's entering into deals which are manifestly illegitimate. And to give you one very concrete example of that, the big Chinese deal in Guinea, about 18 months ago or so, where, if you remember, there was a coup in Guinea, pretty ghastly coup. A young army captain shoots his way to power, and then there are street protests from pro-democracy demonstrators, mass street protests, and he guns them down. he murders 157 people. And then 2 weeks later, so as a result of this coup and this appalling behaviour, the African Union, to its credit, does not recognise this regime. This is an unrecognised and manifestly illegitimate regime. 2 weeks after this murder, mass murder, the Chinese fly in and sign a $7 billion resource extraction deal with the government. And if that's not illegitimate, what is? So the structure of the contract seems to me as an economist actually to have a lot of good features in it, despite breaching Fiscal 101. The process of the contracts has one good feature, this that we're no longer in the business of conditionality, but it's a tainted process. It's got slithers into corruption and illegitimacy. What is missing? What is missing, I believe, is a cleaner process. And the process that I favour is auctions, in which what is auctioned off, if this is what the government wants, is mineral rights, extraction rights are auctioned off in return for infrastructure. And the auction contest is then along the dimension of infrastructure, how much infrastructure will be provided, working down a specified government list of priorities, rather than in the dimension of money. Now that has, and that auction structure has two hugely desirable features. One is it turns a monopolist into a competitive process. The problem with China, in my view, is not the structure of its contracts, it's that it's the only one doing them. And that could be resolved if there was an open competitive process in which other consortia got together. There could be a British consortium, French consortium, an American consortium, what have you. What would these consortia be? The same as what the Chinese do. What the Chinese consortia are is actually, it's even more subtle than just a resource extraction company combined with a construction company. There's an aid element as well. At the moment, the aid element is deeply opaque because the terms of the contracts can't be teased out. But if we had these consortia of construction, resource extraction, aid, along a single dimension of how much infrastructure was provided in return for a specified set of resource extraction costs, then the winner would be revealed as the best value. The contracts could then stay opaque, as it were. The transparency doesn't come from being able to see the details of the contract, they come from the process by which the contracts were won. Let me move from resource extraction to my second distinctive feature of the Chinese engagement with Africa, which is this provision of infrastructure. And why is that important in itself, even if it wasn't linked to resource extraction? Why is it important? Well, first off, because it's been a neglected sector. In about the mid-1990s, the international donor community, which had traditionally focused on infrastructure provision, got bored with it. And they thought they were being made redundant by the go-go private sector, financial sector. They thought that the Goldman Sachs of this world, as a la Dambiza, would fly in and finance all the infrastructure in Africa. And so they'd be redundant doing that. And anyway, what they really needed was votes from Western taxpayers. And Western taxpayers were not terribly excited by infrastructure. They were much more excited by child immunization and getting little kids into primary school. And so what emerged from the mid-90s onward was a social agenda. Spend aid on a social agenda, walk away from infrastructure. So the donors walked away from infrastructure, but unfortunately the Goldman Sachs of this world didn't walk into it. Right? It was too scary for all sorts of reasons that anybody who's listened to Paul Romer will know about. Right? Here he is. So there was a standoff. The money for infrastructure fell apart. And yet, so did African infrastructure. So African infrastructure was decaying, and the money going to build new infrastructure was declining. So it was a neglected sector. Not only that, but it is potentially the key bottleneck sector in the growth process. The growth process is first and foremost about investment. Investment comes in two forms. Investment goods come in two forms: equipment and structures. Equipment is internationally tradable, structures are not. Structures are non-tradable capital goods. That is, they have to, non-traded in the sense they have to be produced within the country. You can't import a building. And yet structures and equipment are complements in the production process. And so you can't have a growth process, an effective growth process, which only has equipment investment. Yeah? Think trucks and roads. You import a lot of trucks, but there are no roads. The return on those trucks rapidly goes down. So here's a bottleneck sector because the structures have to be domestically produced. Over the long period of African stagnation, the miserable 3 decades when Africa stagnated, investment was very low, and therefore the sector producing the non-tradable capital goods withered away. The construction sector, which is the sector doing that, the construction sector in Africa became tiny. There were very few firms, the skills atrophied. No firms, no skills. And now, along come the Chinese, and what do they offer? For the first time, they offer the possibility of turning structures into pretty close to being a tradable good. You don't import the buildings, but the Chinese model is you import everything, including the labor, all the skills, the whole skill set that makes that building. And so, if you think about it as an economist, the supply curve in the construction sector is flattened as a result of the Chinese. And that is analytically enormously important in the growth process. You break that bottleneck. Not only that, are they operating on this new model of everything imported, but they're a very efficient, low-cost operator. They're fast, they're cheap, as far as we can see. Again, it's an opaque area which hasn't properly been studied. But as far as we can make out, they're fast and cheap. So there's the upside of the Chinese in this upstream activity of breaking this bottleneck. And there are two downsides. One is that the Chinese importing everything, including all the workers, has a very clear downside, which is that you don't build employment and the skill base. And that's potentially a really big problem because resource-rich driven growth has few transmission mechanisms onto the well-being of ordinary people. This is its big problem. It has to run basically through state spending in some shape or form. And the one exception to that is going through the construction sector labour market. Jobs for ordinary people. That's the key transmission directly onto the income earning opportunities of ordinary people. And so the Chinese package, the plus is it flattens the supply curve. The minus is that comes at a big cost. No jobs. Just think in post-conflict settings where these bottlenecks are most intense, but what you need in these post-conflict settings is jobs. Especially for young men who are the people most likely to be employed in the construction sector. The shadow price of young male labour in a post-conflict setting is negative. Because if these people are not employed, it's not that they sit at home watching television, it's that they're bloody dangerous. And so having a total bypass of jobs is not a healthy thing. The second problem for the Chinese model is that it's a turnkey operation. It builds these great set pieces of infrastructure and then hand over the end. Contract completed, bye. And that's a real problem. Is that speculation? No, we've seen it before. At least I've seen it before, we've been around so long. But the Chinese did this years ago with Tanzania and Zambia in Tazara, the fantastic railway from Zambia up through Tanzania. An amazing infrastructure project at the time. I see there's Zambians in the audience now, surely some Tanzanians as well. Is Tazara the great lifeline that Zambia uses to get its copper out to world markets? No. Right? No. So that turnkey mode of operation has failed in the past and will fail in the future. That has to be rethought. There has to be a lot of building capacity to run these things as well as building. In fact, the harder part is not building them, it's running them. I've only got 5 minutes, so let me skim through the last features of Chinese engagement, which is not just in the resource extraction sector and the construction sector, it's as a massive source of capital inflow and as a massive source of labour inflow. Capital and labour are flooding in from China. There's huge financial capital on the edge of flooding in through sovereign wealth funds, which can be used in the Chinese model and are committed to being used for mega projects. Those mega projects are badly needed, so it's a very exciting phenomenon. But the Chinese, at the moment, I fear, are not what you might call fully informed investors. They know little of the environments in which they're investing. And that potentially carries risks. Of course, it carries risks to them, but it also carries risks to the recipient. And so what's needed now is to build up more informed Chinese investors. On labour inflow, I think this is the most potentially problematic area. There's only one number that everybody repeats, which is that 750,000 Chinese are in Africa. Everybody cites the same source. So it might be wildly wrong. It's more likely to be an underestimate than an overestimate. What is happening here is settlement as opposed to normal immigration, if I can make that distinction. It's people coming as a community and not really integrating into African society. They are specialized in commercial niches, and this is, to my mind, potentially dangerous. We've seen these dangers elsewhere in Asia. Think of the race riots back in the 1960s in Malaysia. We've seen it in Africa. Think of Idi Amin and the Asian community in Uganda. And so what's missing here, I think, is some hands-on African policy that actually says immigration is always a difficult social phenomenon to handle, and we're going to have strategies to handle that. We're not just going to let this happen in a policy vacuum. Finally, in my last minute, let me pan back to where I started. China is the big operator in Africa now, in all these dimensions. If you look at the international development agencies, you'd never believe it. You'd never believe it. No? When I was at the World Bank, which is a little while ago now, so things might have changed, but when I was at the World Bank, you know, I don't parody. The bank paid more attention to what to Denmark than it did to China. Denmark was very fussed about Africa for perfectly legitimate reasons, and its voice was really heard, and it was really integrated into consultation and decision process. And China wasn't. President Wilkinson had the great idea of appointing one Chinese MD who was promptly sacked by the next president of the World Bank and replaced by a New Zealander, which in sheer geopolitics must be counted as one of the less wide, less shrewd geopolitical moves of the modern time. What's missing? And let me close with a very self-serving example of the Natural Resource Charter, which a number of us have been building. Natural Resource Charter is an attempt to build a public information system for the management of natural resources. And it's a website, you just Google naturalresourcecharter.org, and there it is. Now, in building that organization, we have a board with total power over what happens. And that board is made up as follows. It's chaired by a Mexican, former president, Ernesto Zedillo, and he has 4 board members under him. A Chinese, a Latin American, Middle East, African. The Africans maybe. Not a Dane in sight. That has to be the future of the international organizations for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that very stimulating talk. I think Paul has not shied away from making the basic point that in spite of what many think, China is a good story for Africa. He's also been very open about the downside risks. And it's now time for us to turn to our discussants. Chris Alden is our first discussant. Chris Alden is here at LSE at the International Relations Department. He has recently published a book on China and Africa, in which he is trying to demystify some of the very many misconceptions about that relationship. And I turn now to Chris to share some of his thoughts. I hope in the discussion, the discussants will talk about some of the downsides as well, the whole question of value for money, the question of governance, the question of what will it take for African countries to actually get the benefits on the win-win side of Paul's story. Chris?
Thank you very much. I think just to build on and follow up from Paul Collier's speech or talk, I think it matters that China is a developing country. It matters, and that's part of the reason it's approached Africa in a different way than traditional donors in the OECD countries. It understands that infrastructure is the framework, the hardwiring, the hardware rather, that is necessary, not the software of policy making. You're not going to get anywhere without the infrastructure first. And that I think informed their approach because they themselves lived that development experience and they're transferring that experience to Africa. To unpack some of the particulars with the China-Africa relationship and things that Paul has picked up on, I wanted to focus on the infrastructure deals. One of the concerns that I would have is that too many of these infrastructure deals are linked directly to resource extraction themselves. It's a railroad to a particular mine, which, no doubt about it, in the absence of any railroad, in the absence of any road, is necessary. Markets won't work without communication and ability to move goods back and forth. Absolutely. But China has to go further than that, I think. That's what we are looking for from China. The employment creation issue has been mentioned. Skills transfer. The use of Chinese companies and Chinese finance and Chinese labor very much reflects an almost oversupply within the Chinese domestic setting, and it's part of its going out policy to give exposure to companies in these sectors, to give laborers an outlet, the oversupplied laborers of the rural sector an outlet for employment, but in this case outside of China itself. So I think that this has a downside, and is one of those problems that African governments need to address in their building that relationship with China. Recurrent costs as well. These deals, how long are the resources going to last, and will the road last beyond that, and who's going to pay for it? That sort of thing. Another point to pick up on, again, echoing some of the things that Paul said, the transparency of the deals are by and large not transparent. And it's a concern. It's a concern because on the whether one is getting the value for money, one cannot be truly assessed without understanding what the nature of the deal itself is. There's also concern about accumulation of debt. We've gone through the arduous HIPC process, and take a country like Zambia, had its debt scrubbed, as it were, and then it's moving into some very high-profile deals with Chinese banks, Chinese government. I think this also needs to be watched carefully. I also think it's worth mentioning, just in passing, that there are many Chinas here. When we talk about China, the Exim Bank versus the case that Paul was mentioning with Guinea, the CIF, the China International Fund. One has a commitment to reform to best practice within the import-export banks, with fellow import-export banks. The other one, the CIF, is noted for being deeply secretive. And no surprise, perhaps, that it selects a Guinea to interact with, as one that an XM bank wouldn't. So I think this is important to flag. I think there's a concern here on traditional donors. Absolutely, the Chinese have identified, particularly in a post-conflict setting, the procedural conditionalities that are attached to getting finance quickly to the country and turning that finance into a road that people can use. It's far too long, that time period. So reducing those, as the Chinese have, is important, something that the donor community and the banks, IFIs can learn from. But the question is the impact of China and Africa going to change not just procedural barriers, lower procedural barriers, but is it going to reduce commitments to things like governance? And I think that matters, because when you come to questions of transparency, when you come to questions of infrastructure deals that have no African employment creation side to them, part of the reason that is the case is poor governance on the part of African governments. African governments that care about less about the development implications or opportunities of China, and more about perhaps some other features of the financing that might be there. Okay, so I think that it's important to retain that commitment to governance, to keep not just lower procedural standards, but raise governance standards, and maintain those on the part of donors, traditional donors. My last point is to say that China is, as of 2 years ago, the second largest trading partner. It's probably going to be, the statistics are in the largest trading partner for Africa. But the question is it going to be Africa's best development partner? I think it can do better than what it is doing now, and I certainly hope that we reconvene in a couple of years and can say that with certainty. Thank you.
Turn next to Alden, who we've already been introduced to, who has some thoughts to share with us on this.
Thank you, Gobind, and thank you, Paul. It's always a huge pleasure to listen to Paul. He's immensely persuasive. And I have to say that whenever I do find anything to disagree with, it's always 3 or 4 days later. So I think I'll be in touch. My comments here and now, I guess, are going to be perhaps a little bit anodyne. Let me just pick up a few of the points which Paul's presentation has sort of suggested to me. I think the notion that one is, in a sense, doing a barter operation, one swapping resources for infrastructure, is a very interesting one. Most economists find barter a seriously worrying issue. However, if you've got such shortage of infrastructure that it's obvious that you need to spend some money on, there is a sense in which doing some barter for the inframarginal units, the ones that you're sure you're going to need, there's no sort of decision that has to be taken further, is potentially quite a sensible process and is almost consistent with Fiscal 101. The worry arises when you get up to the marginal point where someone wants to trade infrastructure against schools or against health services or social protection or what have you. And then, of course, it does become very much more difficult. So at least part of the issue is that one's reaction to this, it seems to me, must depend a bit on how much of it goes on. You know, one can have, in a sense, too much of a good thing. It can be a thoroughly good thing to start with, but there comes a point where it's starting to become rather distortionate. I think that the idea of locking in by the finance minister is something that, as a trade policy scholar, I relate to very directly. A large amount of international trade policy is precisely about this thing, making commitments, signing things before your colleagues in the cabinet get to understand, so that indeed your hands are tied when they come and beat up on you. And so it seems that I find that an extremely plausible story. It certainly is also the case, as Paul has attributed to Tim Besley, but also many other scholars now, Mick Moore, for instance, at IDS, have very much brought home to us that the ability, the need and ability to tax the population is one of the things that keeps governments reasonably honest. It's also one of the other things that keeps people engaged with the government in not necessarily a cheerful way, but at least in a constructive way, rather than just sort of denying all legitimacy to the government. Now, I think legitimacy lies at the points that Paul brought up about the process whereby these contracts are signed. And you know, as so often, I mean, I think Paul really put his finger on a very interesting point, that it's not that one wants transparency in the sense of being able to read a contract and see how corrupt it is or inefficient it is, if there is nothing that you can do about it. And that therefore, transparency in the sense of revelation of preferences through a sort of bidding mechanism seems like an extremely sensible process. There is one thing, a sort of technical issue that worries me a little bit about this. Nothing stopped other people from making these offers to the African countries, but no other country did make them. Now, is that just because the Chinese are smarter, they've got more money to spare, they've got more desperation to get natural resources, or is it in some sense that they invested even in finding these opportunities and specifying how they should be written? In other words, it's not immediately clear to me that it's possible to get the Chinese to design the deal for you, so much minerals for so much infrastructure, and then put it out to auction free of cost. The Chinese, having some sense, acquire, if not a right, at least some sort of interest in that. So if you want to have market processes which are entirely even-handed, where lots of people bid for something without any interest, then you've got to find some way of constructing that market, creating the specie, creating the contract, and I think one needs to do that. The real issue over these contracts is exactly the issue that we confront all the time, in fact, in development, and that is, who speaks to the people? What is the legitimacy of the government? And it's not just about infrastructure for resources, it is about where do you put the tertiary hospital? Does it go in the posh suburb of the capital city? Well, it always does, but where do you put the second one? The question is, if you have governments, if the decision-taking process is one that really pays very little regard to the welfare of the people, you're going to get lots of things wrong. And essentially, it seems to me that that's really what this is about. That unless you can be sure that the government is, in a sense, speaking on behalf of the country, then there's lots of reasons to worry that one's going to get the contract wrong. One of the ways around that is, again, in a sense, at least the time consistency, that somehow you get governments to commit to auction stuff, because in that way they will get they'll bypass, as it were, their own biases, as well as bypassing the risks of being ripped off by their partners. I'm sure it's right that infrastructure is a key sector for growth. It is important not to think that it's the only thing that matters. Right? I know that Paul knows better than that, but development of, I think, probably of all branches of economics and possibly public policy is subject to fads and fashions, and we do swing a little bit from infrastructure doesn't matter to infrastructure is all that matters. And the truth, to anyone who thinks about it, we know that it's in between. But let me pose one of the sort of areas in between that seems to be potentially quite important. And Paul mentioned roads and trucking. Very interesting work in the World Bank that suggested that building roads in West Africa is not going to be terribly useful in terms of increasing trade or increasing commerce, because until you demonopolise the trucks industry, all you'll do is cut the time that the goods take to travel and increase the profits of the monopoly truckers. So you do need to have sort of soft infrastructure, you do need to get regulation right in an important way. That's the example that occurs to me, but my guess is that there probably are many other similar examples. So again, in a sense, the issue is not only how do we get the infrastructure built, but how do we get policymakers or communities or whoever, in a sense, to get soft infrastructure, to get a structure whereby it can be used very effectively. Chris mentioned the question of debt relief. It certainly has been something that has exercised many people in the multilateral institutions, that having struggled against debt relief for decades and then eventually come round to it and work hard to deliver debt relief, they find it very galling. The countries immediately go off and apparently get in hot to the Chinese, who never contributed to that debt relief. There's some truth in those worries, but remember that the purpose of debt relief is so that countries can borrow again. The purpose of bankruptcy for people is to get people back into the market, borrowing and investing and so on. So I think it's certainly not the case that you say, look, hell, we gave these people debt relief and it's ridiculous they go out and borrow. It's much more a question of, is that borrowing sensible and sustainable? There is, of course, a public good element to borrowing. The whole debt crisis, in a sense, was about the fact that one country didn't know, we didn't know who borrowing countries were borrowing from, how much they were in debt, and so on. And the very fact that I knew that if they paid Paul off, they wouldn't be able to pay me off, actually made me reluctant to lend and made me scramble to get my money back prematurely. So there is a sense in which everybody who has an interest in Africa in terms of debt already or a willingness to lend has some interest in the extent and I guess the terms of debt that Africans take out with China. But I don't see that as being a particularly Chinese issue. It's just a generic issue about many lenders lending to borrowers. Finally, Gobind mentioned value for money. Many of you will have noticed that this is a little bit of a theme tune of the British government. I mention it at least every 10 minutes, otherwise they fire me. One of the points about tradable commodities, internationally tradable commodities, is that value for money in some sense becomes quite straightforward. You want a bridge? Whoever can provide a bridge of the technical specification required, cheapest, that's the value for money. It doesn't become a complicated issue. Now, it becomes much more complicated if you think there are spillovers. And in a sense, the worry about the sort of build, operate, transfer sort of model which the Chinese are moving towards is that the spillovers are very light. But I think, again, it's important to recognise that if you are desperately short of infrastructure and somebody will build this stuff pretty cheaply and pretty efficiently, that is prima facie a fairly good reason to go with them. And we absolutely shouldn't let ourselves become hung up on all of the spillovers that might be there if only there could have been a local firm or a nice Danish firm, because, get real, there won't be. So I think, again, in a sense, I think very much like Paul, that's a matter of maintaining some balance. I think the Chinese have a very robust attitude towards getting stuff done. And this, as Chris sort of, I think, alluded to, is, partly they have developed in a most remarkable way over the last 40 years by getting stuff done. And I think that one of the attractions to very poor countries in Africa is that the Chinese very naturally come along with fewer of what I hope I have called Danish issues, to worry about the environmental, the labour standards and so on. We may find that upsetting in Western Europe, and indeed some absolutely ghastly things do go on in labour markets around developing countries. But when you're living on $600 a year, then some of that stuff does look fairly luxurious. So again, it's very important to us, I think, when we agonise about whether the Chinese are doing things appropriately, we get that measured against countries that are, whose populations are extraordinarily poor. These are not, this is not us, but it is not the things that necessarily exercise us. So all told, it seems to me that for sure there are things to worry about. For sure the Chinese in 10 years' time will have decided they haven't got it completely right. But in terms of what China's engagement with Africa has brought, it really has brought the potential of many advantages and some things to watch. But anyway.
I'm going to double up and be the discussant for just a minute or two, and then we can open the floor. And what I want to do is really look at the issues laid out from an African perspective. And I want to talk about three things. One, what are Africans' views on these issues? What have Africa's responses been? And how can Africa force China to be a better developing partner? I think African views have stacked themselves up quite clearly. Consumers in African countries are elated with the import manufactures from China. And the evidence of that is in the trade flows. Governments themselves, I think, also, for the kinds of reasons that have already been given, see themselves as welcoming of China overall. But you turn to the other side of the table, and you find a lot of resistance from industry. Industry, particularly manufacturing industry, for good or bad reasons, arguing about deindustrialization taking place, even in areas like textiles, which you would expect for low-income countries to be an area of growth. Labor, for the kinds of reasons Paul has given, feel left out of all of the Chinese labor coming. And the Chinese labor have standards which many African labor markets find quite oppressive. So you have a strong resistance from labor unions and from just the general public about labor. You look at the number of 750,000, or if it's perhaps an underestimate, these are made up not just of construction workers. We have traders. In Ghana, for example, you go to Makala market, every third trader is a Chinese person selling Chinese wares. And it goes to some of the problems that Paul mentioned about Africa not having a strategic immigration policy on this issue. But again, you have a lot of resistance from traders. And let me just mention that all of this has gotten crystallized in a lot of opposition from civil society organizations, which have tried to bring to the fore all of these negatives. So the debates in African countries are much, much more polarized than perhaps you've heard on this panel. And one person who's written about this and done that well, with all its ups and downs, is Adama Gaye, who's a Senegalese journalist, who's tried to put all of this in a recent book, which you might want to look at. What have Africa's responses been? My sense is the one country that seems to be doing best in terms of getting the win-win balance right on the continent is South Africa. South Africa has been able to negotiate voluntary restraints on textile imports from China into South Africa. South Africa has invested in beer manufacturing industries on mainland China, and it's really coming up as a partner. Now, a lot of this has to do with capacity in South Africa and how South Africa sees its own role in the global economy. But I think South Africa does point a way of what other African countries may wish to do more of. I think the general point that the specific point Paul made about immigration, there not being yet a strategic approach to it, is a point you can generalize. It's very clear that China has an Africa policy. Some have described it as aid is business. It's certainly not philanthropy. What is not clear is whether Africa and African countries have developed their own China policy. I think the infatuation with dealing with some of the time inconsistency problems and so on have been very tempting and seducing our act. There's a need for civil society organizations to force governments to take on some of these other strategic issues. South Africa shows the way, some other countries probably do, but there's a lot to be done. But all said and done, I would still go ahead and agree with Paul and the other discussants that the influence of China on the continent is, on a net basis, positive. Much more can be gained if African governments and countries will do even more for themselves. Thank you. We have time for a number of questions from the floor, and I welcome your comments, questions. Tunde,
Gobind has already mentioned that there is a debate in Africa. It's very complex. For some of us who have been engaged in that debate, one of the most difficult issues is what I call the incentive problem. How do you get the African governments to do certain things that you know they should do? Meaning, for example, suppose that you see a deal, even if it is arranged via corruption, you know that they could have done better. And now some of us want to revert to the situation of simply putting it that way as a second best solution. Meaning, for that deal, you could have done better. We don't go and tell them that we know that you got some corruption out of it, money out of it, but you just tell them that, look, the Chinese bought you out very cheaply, you could have done better. That's a second best approach. The first best approach is getting the Africans to do, quote unquote, the right thing, but then it's not easy to see how you get them to do the right thing. You can work through civil society and so on, but that is not so easy. Then there's the second point. Isn't it true that the Chinese also in their own development use some of this approach, the barter approach, whereby they got something from somebody else on a barter basis? I think that historically is the case.
yes.
I think my comment relates to what Sunil just said. Maybe you can help us. I think there are maybe a way of categorizing the countries is countries that the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. Those are the ones that you can probably, IGC and others can probably help because there's a need for technical inputs. There are those where the spirit is willing and the flesh, well, if the spirit is not willing, then of course it matters little what the flesh is going to do. And that's the political side where there isn't really the desire to secure a good deal. Now, first, I think you could help us by just giving us a rough idea of where, from your knowledge and from your experience, where different African countries fit. Because the strategies that one would want to take differ. I think this issue of negotiating contracts and deals goes far beyond the issue of China. I worry a lot that we're not really learning the lessons in terms of the resource extraction in Africa. And the second point, I think it's really important what you said, sir, about China, that we talk about China. Actually, there's many, many Chinas. and there are many kinds of Chinas in Africa. Some of the companies that are active are state-owned enterprises that are really not particularly functional and viable even in China, who, for political reasons, are guided and directed into the African continent. So again, I mean, we probably need a strategy which factors in the kinds of African countries and the kinds of China we're dealing with. But I think maybe you could share some insights for us and give us a little bit more what you see.
Can you identify your place yourself, please? And I'd like everyone else to do that.
It's very hard, but anyway, my name is Chukwuemeka Chikeze. By and large, I'm Sierra Leonean.
Yes, my name is Mr. Comfort from Sustainable Development SB. I had recently a mission for the European Union as team leader for evaluation of all programs on environmental side in Africa. I realized that what European Union is doing now, especially with Lisbon strategy, is to put another Europe in Africa. So they start to put the president of African Union Commission, the president of Council, the Commission of Africa, the regional, the organization, the regional REC, the Regional Economic Organization in Africa. And at the same time, they go to the, let's say, national level. Now, my question is, we have this kind of approach from Europe that has failed from Europe to build Europe. Now, they are going to translate in Africa. The other approach, the other model is the Chinese model. That I would like to call more some kind of firefighting approach. You have a problem, you solve the problem. What Professor Collier says, and I agree with him, I think you need more an approach from bottom, from really know, let's say, the situation of Africa, and start building from what, with real data, build some kind of, let's say, database where we have all the information. You can have, they are spreading. I was involved inside that area. I was with the different government in South Africa, and they very much, they would like to have this bottom-up approach and develop, focusing more towards the strategy, more than firefighting or top-down approach. Thank you.
I'd like to get some from the back. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Olu Ajakai. I work for the ADRC. I just want to thank all the speakers for actually addressing an issue that ADRC has already been engaging in for the past 18 months. We have just concluded studies. The point that I think resonates very well with our study is the fact that China is a big thing now in Africa. China is here. You cannot avoid it. The question therefore is, what should you do to maximize the opportunities and avoid the challenges or deal with challenges? That's the thrust of the study, and I think the presentations today have actually reinforced that. Maybe apart from complaining about the behaviors of China, what we may be doing is, what should Africa, the government, the people, the business community, I mean, Gobind, I just mentioned every stakeholder has different perspectives on this matter. What should we all do together to ensure that in the net, our continent maximizes the opportunity that China has created and also avoid the pitfalls? If you can have insights into how to deal with this and the capacity building that is required, then I think we shall be moving forward in the area of ensuring that China-Africa engagement is, as stated in their policy, a win-win situation. Thank you very much.
Rama, please.
Yes, I'm Rama Sitanan. I used to be Minister of Finance in Mauritius, so I don't have to dream about it, Paul. I'm not sure whether the economics I studied, 35 years here was 101 or 100. Now, as a policy maker, I've had to address this issue like many ministers of finance from Africa. I think the strategy is to maximize the two opportunities that Professor Collier mentioned. And these are two great opportunities. One, competition. And second, investment in infrastructure. And I totally agree with Paul that infrastructure is probably the single most important obstacle to sustain and robust development in Africa. Once you've decided on this, then I think this gentleman just mentioned is how do you mitigate the downside by engaging with China to make China become a much better development partner. And I think a lot of it depends on us also. Very often when we speak about Africa, it's not one country. There are 50 countries. And China very often, will discuss, negotiate, and conclude deal on a one-to-one basis. Now, some of the issues that you mentioned, we have had to do it ourselves, because Mauritius is one of the few countries where they have decided to invest in a trade and economic zone, notwithstanding the fact that we don't have extraction industry. And some of these issues did come up. First one is the transparency of the contract. Now, that depends on the institution that you have back home. Now, if we have to submit to Parliament all contract or loan agreements that are signed between Mauritius and another country, obviously this will be known to the public. The other issue, which you mentioned, is labor. Very often they will come with lock, stock, and barrels. But here also you have to negotiate. And we've been able to put restriction on the number of Chinese who come. Again, with a view to getting the consensus, from the public, because the public will ask, what's easy for me? And you spoke of the transmission mechanism in some of these sectors, and we have been able to get people to be employed in sectors that are funded by the Chinese. The other issue that you mentioned is about, I think the gentleman from DFID also mentioned it, is where will the hospital be? Where will the infrastructure be? I think it's incumbent on the political leadership to decide, what will be in the best interest of where the infrastructure will be. There is no reason, to surrender this prerogative of deciding what should be your development strategy to China or to any other country. And with respect to value for money, I do agree with you. I think you use the term fast and cheap. But you must make sure also that you get value for money. And there are many ways of ensuring that you do get value for money. So in my humble submission, and based on the discussion that we have had, I think it's Africa, or our friends in Africa, us in Africa, will have to do our homework and to make sure that labor standards are respected, environmental norms are respected, and that we get the best of the China deal while obviously mitigating the adverse impact that this could have on our countries.
The lady in the back, sorry. Yeah.
Quick question, which is what's next for academia? What kind of areas would you like to see academics and researchers doing, fleshing out further information or ideas about China and Africa in the near future? That was it.
Yes.
Thank you. Raj Kohli, been involved in the mining industry, including in Africa, for many, many years in different guises. I'd just like to take up a point that Professor Collier made on auction systems, trying to find a system which might be more fair to all stakeholders concerned in terms of distribution of profits from the natural resources inherent in the continent. I think one of the issues is that China asides, if you look at other bidders for assets in a significant number of jurisdictions in Africa, the nature of those bidders is such, or the nature of their bids is such, that they themselves, and those bidders coming from the Western world, so to speak, their bids are such that they do not stand, they would not stand scrutiny under proper corporate governance standards. And I quote you two very recent examples, I'm sure you're fully aware of them. Not passing judgment on them, but ENRC, FTSE 100 listed company, in a tremendous spat with First Quantum in DRC on copper cobalt. Second example, ArcelorMittal, world's largest steel producer, significant miner. It has received tremendous criticism for the nature in which it has played its hand in iron ore in South Africa. And I'm just quoting but two examples. So I think there are very few alternatives, or there are very few options to trying to structure a type of auction system, which I agree with you. I think it should be in place, and I think it would help a lot of the nations on the continent of Africa. But I think it is very challenging to arrive at a system which can actually achieve that.
Take one last question. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I am Amara Sharif from Sierra Leone. Agreed the Chinese infrastructure projects in Africa is a turnkey project which did little or nothing on capacity building. But what I did not see come out of the presentation is the role of the Chinese private sector in the African economies. And the Chinese private sector actors are very vibrant in African economies these days. They are in construction, they are in medicine, they are in infrastructure, they are in road construction, etc., etc. And also the South-South cooperation between Africa and China in terms of capacity building. I did not see that come out, and I want to comment on that.
We have some time constraints, so what I'm going to suggest is that we hear from the discussants first, up to 2 minutes each, and then give Paul some 5 minutes at the end. They're obviously going to pick on some of these questions, not everything, but we have the networking sessions and other opportunities to...
Being a crucial player here, many of the things we've identified, as was noted in the questions and by the speakers, as China-Africa problems, actually one has to look in the mirror and say, are these not actually African problems, African governance problems? The rules are on the books. The agencies are underfunded or constantly being undermined in their fulfillment of their legal duties, of oversight duties. Because we have to remember that Chinese companies can operate and subscribe to legally dense, complex economic, fiscally complex environments in the OECD world. And why don't they abide by the same set of rules in the African settings, in some African settings? One has to look, as I say, in the mirror perhaps and ask why those rules aren't being enforced. And then the second point I would make is just with respect to where does, and the academic question at the back, where's the field to go? I think that firm level studies, looking at Chinese firms, breaking down this notion as the speakers and others have said, that there is a China and an Africa, when in fact there are many Chinas and indeed there are many Africas. And we can understand better that relationship by looking at it through these very specific targeted studies, sectoral studies, firm-level studies. And then finally, I would also hope that we would move away a little bit from China, Africa as such, and maybe contextualize it. Many of these things we're talking about, the critiques we have of Chinese firms in Zambia, for instance, ignore some of the behavior of other firms, which can be equally, if not more, poor in labor standards or commitments to fulfilling those sorts of legalities. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Let me just take up the issue of governance very briefly. You asked sort of how do we get the African governments to do the right thing. The question in a sense is right for whom? Some of the people who signed these contracts did just the right thing for them. And I think that comes back exactly to this point, that there is a general governance challenge that is not just specific to this. In a sense, the issue is that if you have dysfunctional governance and somebody turns up with a very large amount of money, somehow it's just more costly. So I think one can't view this the issue of governance as being a China-Africa issue. It is, in general, something which Africa is making some progress on, and we wish luck and we will be as supportive as we can, but ultimately one does need to sort of address these things locally. It just can't be done from the outside. Transparency, press and so on is a great help, and in a sense patience and fortitude are also necessary parts. Secondly, on the issue of capacity building, I think that's a very interesting question. It is true, we didn't talk much about capacity building. The Chinese communities in Africa are very vibrant. Sometimes, of course, that's the very thing that's causing the sort of social irritation that Gobind has talked about. It suggests to me that on both sides there's a real need to try and get some integration so that the two sides are not sort of at each other's throats, but actually are willing to learn from each other. Then indeed, it seems to me one of the really big advantages of migration overall is that people do learn from each other what's possible, the way to sort of construct social situations and carry things out. So I think there's a lot to play for in that particular area, not at the governmental, intergovernmental issue, but right down on the ground with a migration policy that encourages integration, but on both sides. Thanks. Paul.
Yeah, let me start with something that's really important, which is a question Alan raised, which is why is China a monopolist? There's nothing legally stopping other consortia going in and bidding, so why aren't they? And I think there are two sorts of impediments. One is, from the donor side, there's a sort of reluctance. In Europe, it's a squeamishness that we don't want to use aid for anything as vulgar as digging up natural resources. It's too environmentally unfriendly. We'd rather do something that's warm and cozy. And so for the European Development Agency, it's a no-no for that reason. It's just the wrong visuals. For America, America actually used to be in on this in the early 80s, and it got pulled off by the American government under Reagan, not for reasons of squeamishness that it would be nice if only the US aid spent its money on children, what have you, but because the influences on Ronald Reagan were such that this should be left, the American companies going in for resource extraction shouldn't have to face any competition. But for different reasons, the big global players other than China, the donors, haven't been there. Now there's another deeper reason, which Alan also alluded to, which is you'll only get a market once you've got reasonable geological information. You need a minimum amount of geological information before, which then reveals that there are potential rents there, and then you'll get enough actors to have a competitive auction. And then you pre-screen and you filter a lot of them out. You need about 4 reputable bidders. To get there is damn hard. It's not just a matter of hold an auction and hope people show up. They won't. You'll actually reveal that you've only got one company interested and you're worse than you started. So the prior step in building a competitive auction process is in investing in geological information. And this is again something that the donors could do. It's much less risky if the big donors invest across a lot of African countries than if each African country is left to make these risks itself. Because if you research on a bigger area, given this number I started with, there's so little being discovered in Africa, it's a sure bet. If each little country has to dig up its own area, then who knows? Right? So step 1, invest in geological information, then pre-screen to keep the charlatans out. One thing I should have raised, which is the Chinese are pretty tough in the details of the contracts where we can see them, and we often can't. They play hardball. If you look at these things that lawyers call stabilisation clauses, it's how easy is it to renegotiate this contract? And the Chinese go for absolutely at the extreme end of very tough stabilisation clauses, resolution with the dispute settlement boards, all the things which actually the Western resource extraction companies wouldn't dream of trying to use. Right? So it's a much tougher game. Gobind raised the issue of, very rightly, that the Chinese are sell an awful lot of very cheap consumer goods to Africa, and that's caused some deindustrialization, and that's a big issue. It's also made it much harder for Africa to break in at the bottom in global manufacturing markets. This is a big issue. Africa needs to diversify its economies by breaking in. The sort of thing Mauritius did in the 1980s. How did Mauritius do it? Mauritius was hugely helped by the multi-fiber agreement, which gave you privileged market access in OECD markets. That's dead. And at the moment, the only equivalent of that is a scheme run by America, the Africa Growth and Opportunity. What we need is a global scheme. At the minimum, an OECD scheme, but better. You know, let's go. China should be offering privileged access to its markets, as well as. Right? So it's important, and it's just becoming feasible because wages are now rising very fast in China. And so over the next decade, a shrewd manufacturer will start to think, where can I relocate my manufacturing, my labor-intensive manufacturing, from increasingly high-wage China to somewhere else. So the Super AGOA scheme is, I think, a very important opportunity. And finally, the really good question, what are the research issues? Let me just suggest two. One upstream, one downstream. The upstream issue, the discovery process. How valuable is geological information for this building a competitive process? I came across a natural experiment, not in Africa, but in PNG, Papua New Guinea, where a donor had meant to provide geological information across a whole territory, but ran out of money. And so they only provided geological information on half of this territory. The money just ran out. Come back a few years later, and the resource extraction in the territory where there's geological information is 5-fold per square mile that of the territory which didn't have the geological information. So the payoff to geological information, very big. Let's try and research that more thoroughly and just about throw out examples. Up at the downstream agenda, I talked about the importance of the construction sector and the bottlenecks and the slope of that supply curve as a concept. The slope of the supply curve in the construction sector is a function of policy choices. There's a whole chain of policies which affect that slope, make it steep or flat. From the urban land market, what you do with cement, what you do at the ports, how you handle competitive tendering. And so research which first quantifies this concept of the elasticity of the construction supply curve and then shows how it's a function of policy, how you can flatten it. Just so one upstream, one downstream. There are lots of researchable issues here, and it's big time stuff. Thank you.
Okay, we are very much short of time, so I'm just going to conclude quickly. I'm not going to try and summarize things, but I asked myself, if I had to say it in one sentence, what have we been saying from this side of the table and from the discussion? And I think what we're saying is China is probably a good story for Africa, but potentially it's a great story. A lot depends on how much African countries themselves can step up to the plate. And here I want to stress something that was mentioned and something that was not. I think capacity building has been seen too much as something that external partners should help African countries to build. I think it is time for us to see this as our own responsibility. Use some of the oil revenues, the revenues we get for our own capacity building, tailored to giving ourselves this ability to get win-win transactions out of the deals with China and other countries. The other thing is that there's an unsung hero in all of this. I think you're seeing across African countries civil society organizations increasingly playing an important role in holding the feet of governments to the fire. And this is something that needs to be encouraged in whatever way possible. And the kind of ideas about research that have been put on the table and others are really the kind of fodder that civil society organizations need to bring much more to the table than they're currently doing. But the scene is changing, and we see CSOs playing an important role. let me just conclude by thanking Paul and our other discussants for what I think has been an excellent discussion, and for all of you for your patience and your participation.